The bitter chill of an English morning in 1847 sliced through the tattered coat of young Eliza Cartwright as she waited in line outside the towering iron gates of the Shoreditch Workhouse in East London. Her hands were raw from the cold, her eyes hollow with hunger, and her spirit nearly broken by weeks of begging for scraps on street corners after her mother died of consumption and her father vanished into the smoke of the city. Eliza, at only 14 years old, had no choice but to seek refuge in the workhouse, a place spoken of in whispers by those who still had homes to sleep in and fires to warm their bones. The massive building loomed like a prison with barred windows and a smell of damp straw and boiled gruel escaping from its brick walls. The gate creaked open, and the master of the workhouse, a stern man with sunken cheeks and sharp eyes, motioned for the line of applicants to enter. Eliza clutched the small bundle that held her only possessions, a rag doll, a cracked comb, and a faded photo of her mother as she stepped inside the foyer, echoed with the shuffling feet and soft sobs of other destitute souls. They were stripped of their belongings and scrubbed with freezing water before being separated by gender and age. Eliza was led to a ward for girls where rows of narrow beds lined the stone walls, and the air was thick with sickness and despair. Work began at dawn and ended at dusk, with only 2 meals of thin porridge and stale bread breaking the monotony. Eliza was assigned to the laundry room where steam burned her skin and lye stung her hands, but complaining was forbidden and silence was expected. The matron, Miss Broom, a woman as cold as the tiles on the floor, kept watch like a hawk and punished even the smallest infractions with solitary confinement or loss of food days blurred into weeks, and Eliza watched as children around her grew sick, some disappearing overnight without explanation. She learned not to ask questions, not to cry, and not to hope. But she could not forget the stories her mother told her of a better world beyond the soot-stained sky. She began to scribble them on scraps of laundry tags, hiding them under her mattress, creating her own secret journal of dreams in a place designed to crush them. On the other side of London, in a wealthier quarter, a curious young man named Henry Blackwood began an investigation that would intertwine his fate with Eliza's. Henry was the son of a progressive member of Parliament, and unlike most of his peers, he had a fascination with the hidden corners of society. He often walked through alleyways where most gentlemen feared to tread, sketching scenes of poverty and listening to the stories of those ignored by the empire. He believed that real reform required understanding and not just policy. One winter evening, after a heated debate in the House of Commons about poor relief, Henry decided to see a workhouse for himself, not from the polished perspective of a politician, but from the ground where the poor walked. He disguised himself in rough clothes and visited Shoreditch claiming to be a beggar, seeking shelter. The overseer accepted him without question, and Henry soon found himself assigned to the same laundry room as Eliza. He kept to himself, at first observing the brutal conditions and the ruthless efficiency of the system, but his curiosity was piqued when he noticed a small girl with a wild determination. In her eyes she moved through the drudgery with a quiet fire, unlike the others who seemed utterly defeated one day as they folded sacks together. He found a crumpled piece of cloth with writing on it. It was a story about a girl who escaped a castle of sorrow by planting hope in the hearts of others. Eliza noticed him holding it and snatched it back, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't tell," she whispered, trembling. Henry shook his head and whispered back, "I won't." He realized then that she was not just surviving, but resisting in her own way. He began to speak with her during stolen moments, learning about her mother, her dreams, and her refusal to let the workhouse erase her soul. Eliza woke before dawn to the sound of the matron's whistle. Shrill and cold in the dim barracks where the girls slept, she rose from her straw mattress, back aching from the night, and began her morning duties without complaint. She had grown accustomed to the silence that hung in the corridors of the workhouse, a silence born not of peace, but of fear and exhaustion. In the women's quarters, the air always smelled of soap and sickness. Her tasks that morning included scrubbing the long-tiled floor with a stiff brush, washing a dozen chamber pots, and sorting rags for the mill, Every movement was watched by the supervisors who stood like sentinels, arms folded, faces stone. The girls were not permitted to speak during labor, and infractions were punished with bread and water for dinner or worse, isolation. In the dark cellar, known only as the box. Yet despite the cruelty, Eliza found a kind of strange rhythm in the routine. The work numbed the ache of hunger and the endless sorrow of remembering a world that had once held warmth, her only true comfort. Was Sarah a girl of 12 with fire-red hair and a limp from a childhood fever? They had become inseparable, whispering stories under blankets and sharing crusts of bread. When the other wasn't looking one evening after supper, Eliza noticed Sarah hadn't returned from the infirmary where she'd been sent with a fever that morning. Concerned, she waited by the stairwell long after curfew until she spotted the nurse returning alone, her face tight and unreadable. Eliza dared to ask, "Where's Sarah?" and the nurse paused, eyes flicking toward the floor, then away. "She didn't make it, child. She's gone." Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She didn't cry. Not at first. Instead, she walked slowly back to the dormitory and lay awake, staring. At the ceiling, the night seemed longer than any she had endured before. By morning, something inside her had shifted. The loss of Sarah carved a hole so deep it became a kind of resolve. She began to observe everything more closely. The routines of the staff, the supply rooms, the way the master's keys jingled as he passed on his rounds. She noticed the schedule of the deliveries from the baker, the rotation of the guards, and the peculiar habit of the matron to sneak off for long moments. Behind the chapel on Sundays, Eliza had no plan yet, only a swelling need to escape and a growing sense that no one would come to save them. Not the church, not the Queen, not even the stars that once gave her hope. There was a girl named Margaret, who had tried to run before they said she made it as far as the canal before she was caught and dragged back, beaten so badly she didn't speak again for weeks. But Eliza wasn't Margaret. She wouldn't run blindly. She would plan, and she would not go alone. The days stretched on, and Eliza kept her head down, playing the part of the obedient child, all while watching, waiting, measuring every detail until she was ready. And when the day came, it arrived without fanfare, a gray morning like any other except for the note she had smuggled to the boys' dormitory, scrawled on a scrap of cloth. "Meet me at the coal chute. Midnight, bring rope." When the bell tolled 12, Eliza crept silently from her cot, heart thudding like thunder in her chest. She made her way through the shadows to the rear storeroom, where the coal chute led to the alley below. Waiting for her was Thomas, a wiry boy with clever eyes who had been in the workhouse longer than anyone Eliza had ever known. He didn't speak, only handed her the rope and gestured toward the chute. They tied the rope to a beam and one by one slipped into the darkness beyond. It wasn't freedom, not yet, but it was movement, and for the first time in years, Eliza felt the air in her. Lungs like fire and hope combined. They ran through the alley, hearts pounding, avoiding the street lamps, ducking behind crates and wagons, until the walls of the workhouse vanished behind them, and the sky opened above them wide and unforgiving. They didn't know where they were going, only that they had left the place of the forgotten poor, the prison, for the innocent and the lost, and for that night it was enough. The streets of London at night were a maze of gaslight flickers, echoing footsteps, and shadowy doorways. Eliza and Thomas had no destination, only the instinct to move, to keep running, and to never look back. From the moment their feet hit the cobbled alley outside the coal chute, every sound became a threat, every flicker of lantern a possible captor. They passed sleeping drunks, ragged beggars, and soot-covered chimney boys. None paid them attention, for in a city bloated with poverty, 2 more starving children hardly caused a stir. They ducked into a narrow passage behind a butcher's shop, huddled beneath discarded crates. Their breaths fogged in the cold air, and their hands trembled, not from fear alone, but from hunger, exhaustion, and the uncertainty of what they had just done. "We can't stop," Thomas whispered. "They'll be out looking for us by dawn." Eliza nodded but said nothing. She stared up at the sky through a break in the rooftops. The stars were still there, cold and far. Away just as they'd always been after some rest, they moved on walking until their feet blistered and their bones ached by sunrise. They found themselves near the docks where the city opened into the gray waters of the Thames here. Everything smelled of fish rot and coal smoke, and the noise of ships loading and street vendors shouting gave the illusion of life that pulsed with opportunity. Even for those with nothing, they stole crusts of bread from open market stalls and drank rainwater. Collected in broken barrels, always moving, always watching for the black coats of the parish constables, Thomas had heard of a chapel in Southwark where a kind priest sheltered runaways. It took them 2 days to find it slipping past slums and market. Crowds until they arrived at a crumbling brick church with ivy strangling its sides and a bell tower that hadn't rung in years. The priest was old with cloudy eyes and a limp, but his voice was gentle, and he asked no questions, only offered bread, and a blanket and a night's sleep in the cellar. For the first time in weeks, Eliza's hands stopped shaking. She slept so deeply she forgot where she was, until Thomas shook her awake before dawn. "We can't stay too long, they'll come here eventually." And he was right. Kindness was not a shield, and word traveled fast in the streets of children who had escaped the workhouse and lived to tell of it. The priest gave them directions to a seamstress on the edge of Whitechapel who needed help with her mending work and sometimes paid in coins or warm meals. Her name was Mrs. Bell, and she was a widow with no children of her own, bent by years at the loom and smelling of lavender and mothballs. Eliza and Thomas worked for her during the day, stitching buttons and hemming skirts, and in return she fed them lentils and bread and gave them a corner of the attic to sleep in. It wasn't much, but to Eliza, it felt like royalty to have a place to belong, and no one shouting orders over her head. She found comfort in the rhythm of the needle, the way the thread looped and pulled, and how her hands became steadier each day, as if she were stitching herself back together with every garment she repaired. Thomas, meanwhile, took work running errands for the dock hands and learned how to lift apples and coins from carts without being caught. The world beyond the workhouse was dangerous, but it was also free, and for a brief moment they allowed themselves to believe they had escaped for good. But the illusion cracked one evening when Eliza was returning from the bakery with stale bread in her hands and saw 2 parish officers speaking to Mrs. Bell at her doorstep. She didn't go inside. Instead, she ran finding Thomas by the river's edge, where he was skipping stones. "They're looking for us again," she said, breathless and cold. His face darkened, and they knew the time had come to leave behind safety once more. Their journey took them north to Camden, where factories sprawled like iron giants and smoke choked the sky. They joined dozens of other children begging for work outside the mills. Eventually, they were hired at a match factory run by a sour man named Griggs, who paid them a few pennies a week to dip sticks in phosphorus and box them for sale. Eliza's fingers burned from the chemicals and her teeth ached from the fumes, but she said nothing. Thomas kept close, always watching, always guarding her from the men who leered too long or spoke with menace in their voices. And so the days passed, gray and grinding, with no clear future, but no chains to bind them. Either one morning, a girl in the factory collapsed, screaming, clutching her jaw as blood poured from her mouth. Her bones were rotting from the poison in the matches, and Griggs ordered the others back to work, stepping over her as if she were a fallen broom. Eliza stood frozen, watching the girl convulse, and something inside her snapped. She turned to Thomas and whispered, "We can't stay, not here. Not like this. We'll die the way Sarah did, without anyone remembering our names," and he nodded. For the first time, she saw tears in his eyes. They fled that afternoon, leaving their wages behind, and the echo of the girl's screams haunting their steps. They walked until they reached Hampstead Heath, where the trees whispered above them and the city noise faded into bird song and wind. "We'll go further," Eliza said, "beyond the smoke, beyond the factories, somewhere they don't know our names." They found a traveling show camped on the edge of the heath, a troupe of performers with painted wagons and colorful clothes and faces lined with stories. The leader, a tall woman named Madame Rue, with gold hoops in her ears and fire in her smile, took one look at the children and said, "You've seen things, haven't you? Come, then we always have room for ghosts." She taught Eliza how to dance with ribbons, how to move like mist and light, while Thomas learned to juggle and play the fiddle they became. Part of the show earning pennies in villages and cheers from children, and in their laughter, Eliza felt a part of her old self return. For the first time, she remembered what joy sounded like, what it felt like to twirl without fear and to fall into sleep without dread. Though they never stopped looking over their shoulders, though the shadows of the workhouse never truly left them, Eliza began to believe that the past did not have to be a prison, that maybe they could become something. More than forgotten poor, more than the names on a ledger in a parish office, they were survivors, and their story was still being written. And in every dance, every song, every mile traveled, they stitched a new life from the rags of the old one, and the world began to open its arms just a little wider than before. Winter crept across the English countryside like a silent thief, blanketing the fields with frost and stiffening the canvas flaps of the traveling troops' wagons. The vibrant colors of Madame Rue's performers faded beneath layers of patched wool and soot. But the show continued. Towns still paid for wonder, and children still clapped at the sight of flame swallowers and dancing ribbons. Eliza had become one of the main attractions. Twirling beneath lantern light, her eyes catching the glow like amber fire, every performance gave her the strength to forget, even for a little while, the stench of the workhouse, the cries from the infirmary, the cold silence after Sarah's death. Beside her, Thomas grew into a young man, his once thin frame now taut from daily labor and practice. His fingers swift across the fiddle as if they had been born for music, yet despite the joy their past followed them like a ghost unseen, but felt. One night in the village of Luton, as they performed in the church square, a pair of familiar eyes locked onto Eliza's from the crowd, a man in a dark coat, his jaw lined with gray and his mouth drawn into a tight line, the parish inspector, Mr. Wentworth. Eliza's heart thundered as memories surged into her chest, pressing like cold stones against her lungs. She finished the dance with force, Grace bowing as the crowd applauded, but her hands trembled and her breath came shallow. She fled backstage, grabbing Thomas by the sleeve. "He's here," she whispered the inspector from Shoreditch. "He saw me." Thomas stiffened, then nodded slowly. "We run." Tonight, they didn't wait to pack the troop left under cover of dark wagon wheels turning over frozen dirt, pulled by weary horses and haunted by silence. Madame Rue said nothing, but her gaze burned with unspoken questions by morning they reached the edge of a forest where the road split into 3 paths and snow fell in quiet sheets. Eliza and Thomas made their decision. They would leave the troop not out of anger or fear, but necessity. The longer they stayed, the greater the risk to their newfound family. They embraced Rue one last time. She pressed a silver pendant into Eliza's palm. It had no coin value, but was etched with a star and an eye. "It will remind you to watch the world, not just with fear, but with fire and wisdom," she said, then turned without another word and vanished into the morning mist. The forest was deep and strange, filled with twisted trees and paths that wound in circles. They walked for days, eating berries and sleeping beneath trees. Eliza's shoes wore through, and Thomas fashioned her moccasins from sackcloth held together with twine. One evening they stumbled upon a cottage abandoned and broken, with a collapsed roof and vines strangling the door. But the fireplace still stood, and inside they found scraps of furniture enough to make it home for the time being. They lived like ghosts, gathering roots, fishing from the stream, and boiling wild herbs into bitter soups. Time passed not in days, but in seasons. The forest became their refuge, their teacher, and eventually their friend. They read from old books left behind in the cottage, practiced writing on birch bark, and mapped the stars from the clearing behind the trees. Eliza began to keep a journal, chronicling everything they remembered. From the workhouse, not just the pain, but the names, the routines, the injustices. She wrote of Sarah, of Margaret, of the nameless boys buried in the back lot where weeds grew tall and nobody prayed. Thomas helped draw diagrams of the building of the coal chute, of the infirmary, of the punishments. Eliza had a vision not just of freedom, but of testimony. They would not be forgotten. They would not let the world pretend that children did not suffer behind those brick walls. One spring morning, a group of traveling educators arrived in a nearby village, spreading word of new laws debates in Parliament about child labor and poverty reform. A young teacher named Miss Holloway listened as Eliza told part of her story and invited her to speak. At a public forum in the town of Reading, Eliza hesitated, but Thomas pushed her forward gently with a nod. "You have a voice, now use it." She stood before a crowd of strangers, trembling, but clear she told them of her mother's death, of the masters. Cain of Sarah's fever, and of the cellar called the box. The hall was silent, but their eyes were not blank. They were awake, alive, enraged. When she finished, Miss Holloway wept and took her hand. The following months changed everything. Newspapers printed Eliza's words titled, "The Forgotten Poor Members of Parliament Requested Interviews." Thomas even spoke to a pamphlet publisher who printed drawings of the workhouse floor plans with captions like, "This is where they lock the children," or "The Price of Poverty." Reformers rallied and called for inspections. Some workhouses were shut down altogether. New laws were passed, demanding better treatment, oversight, and education. Within those walls, the poor would no longer be left in darkness. The journey was not swift nor complete. There were still places where cruelty reigned, still children who slipped through cracks and cried unheard. But a crack had been made in the silence, and Eliza had wielded the hammer years later. She and Thomas opened a shelter for orphans not in the city, but in a valley near the forest, where kindness was stitched into every wall. They called it Sarah's Haven. In memory of the girl who taught Eliza to laugh, even in chains. It had a garden, a library, a fire that never went out. Children who arrived trembling from the streets were met with warm bread and songs by the hearth. They were taught letters, numbers, history, and most of all, dignity. Eliza never returned to Shoreditch, but her writings did. They were preserved, published, studied in schools for generations. They bore witness, they endured, and in their endurance they birthed change. Eliza Cartwright, once a girl with frost-bitten fingers and hollow eyes, became a woman whose fire lit the way for thousands. She never forgot the workhouse, never forgot the smell of gruel or the cold stone floors, but she refused to let it define her. She refused to let it consume her voice, and in the end, the world remembered not just her suffering, but her strength, her courage, and her refusal to be erased from history. She had escaped the walls not just of brick and iron, but of silence, and in doing so, she gave hope to all those who still wandered the margins, searching for a way out, searching for someone to say, "I see you, I remember you, you matter."